I am. So thanks for the warm welcome, guys. Thanks, Ryan. I actually realized while I was preparing for this morning that I recently hit quite a big milestone. So 25 years since in my late teens I gave my life to Jesus. Can I hear an amen? Thank you. And 20 years, as Ryan said, since I started working, since I actually got my first paying job and stopped letting my parents look after me financially. So let's have an amen for that too. Thanks. Thanks, guys. But I've realized in the 20 years I've pretty much been working in business, in that time I've heard a lot of different things around what it really means to do mission. And it can be a bit confusing, particularly for those of us who are in secular work. And my sense is that a lot of us don't necessarily have clarity on what it really looks like, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, whatever you work, to actually serve God in your workplace. So I'm really excited to be here this morning. Thunder, that's gone. That might come later when I get really passionate, but we'll see. I'm really excited to be here because this is something for me personally that is like right in the middle of my own heart. Cricky, my wife, also, we hold this dear. It's really the reason why we as a family have been in Johannesburg for these four or so years. And it's also, I believe, right in the middle of my calling, and I believe many of your callings as Christians. So I just want us to begin with the passage that Olga just read. Let's just focus on the second half of it from Romans 12. So I'm not going to do I'm not a preacher, you guys know that. I'm a business guy. I'm not going to do an exposition on this and go through the Greek genesis of each word. But I just want to talk us to explore today as I tell a few stories and use a few ideas and frameworks. 3 big questions that this raises. Firstly, what does it really look like for each of us to live as a living sacrifice? Not here on a Sunday morning, not just to worship in church or at church meetings or in our quiet times or whatever we call our times with God alone. What does it really look like to worship King Jesus in the week when we're in a meeting or on a conference call or we're sitting at our desk at home alone or out on a job at site? What does that look like? What does it look like for us to be, as Christians here, we're deeply embedded in this real world, right? We're not like, this isn't where we live and eat in this bubble. We're out there in the week. What does it look like for each of us to be part of that real world, but not to be conformed to it? Those strong currents of worldly ways of doing things can be really hard to resist. How do we resist the pressure to conform? How do we live like Jesus wants us to? And this part about renewal of our minds, don't conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What does it look like to see the world as Jesus wants us to make plans and to think, even to think about work stuff as Jesus would have us think, to actually act in a way that reflects renewal and Jesus' mission for us? I believe if we focus today on these questions, then God is going to reveal, as it says here, more of his will for us, his good, perfect, and pleasing will for our lives. So, before we get into any more, I just want to do a little bit of market research with you guys, just to kind of establish a bit of relevance, really. So, hope you're all awake. Can I ask you, please put your hand up if you work currently in any kind of a secular organization. It might be in government, big or small. It might be in an NGO, non-profit. It might be in a business, your own, someone else's, tiny, massive. Any of those things, please, hands in the air. Lots of people in the room working in the secular world at the moment. And I know many of you, probably nearly all of us, live in a household, I would imagine, where someone is working in the secular world. So even if it's not you personally, there's someone in your household that you need to encourage today. I'd like you to raise your hands. Who here works in business? Okay, that's a lot of people. Who works in non-profit or government? Quite a few as well. Thank you. Who here, put your hand up if you're a leader or a manager in the organization that you currently work in? Quite a big number, actually. It's quite a high proportion. And any founders, any CEOs in the room? Big shout out. Awesome. So it's a lot of us, right? Now put your hand up if you feel, of those of you who've put your hand up at some point, tell me, do you feel called to the work that you're doing? Raise your hand if you feel called. So it feels like about a half, something like that. I mean, like, yeah, this is very statistical. I'm going to write a report on this afterwards and publish it. So many of us, huge proportion of us, at least household-wise, are involved in secular work, right? Many of us, some of us feel called, but the reality is this is where most of us are spending most of our waking hours, right? I mean, tell me if you think I'm wrong, but I think that's true. I love to ask people questions, particularly about why they do what they do. It's like my favorite question at work, but also with friends at church. And I often ask people, why is it that you do the work that you do? Really tell me, like, not just because, I got this promotion or that promotion, but really, like, why? What's God put you there for? And I typically get a couple of answers, really good answers, right? So one answer I get is that God's put me here. I believe I'm called to witness relationally, verbally, to my colleagues in the workplace. The second answer I get is, I believe God's put me here, maybe as a tent maker ministry, financial. It's like I'm working over here, the money's coming in, and I'm giving over here. Maybe I'm supporting my own ministry, like Paul was with his tent making. So, like witnessing and giving, those are the two main reasons from my own statistical research that I find when I ask why people do what they do. And I just want to look at those quickly. So, let's look at witnessing. Thank you. If I do this, it's, very good. So in 1 John 3, dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. I'm not trying to say, look, I think verbal witness, telling people about Jesus is like the cutting edge of what we're here to do, right? I'm not trying to undermine that. But the Bible teaches clearly that our actions, how we actually live around these people, what we actually do, also matters a lot. Now let's look at tent making. Let's go to the next passage, Acts 20. You yourselves know that these hands of mine, this is Paul speaking about the Apostle Paul, about his tent-making job that he did, as well as all the ministry he did with the churches as he traveled. These hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions. In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work, we must help the weak, etc. Paul wasn't just there to earn money, but he was working as a tent maker to model life to the church. What he actually did, how he did his work. He wanted to show people a way of living. So the what of what he was doing, not just the financial outcome of it, was really important as well. So yes to witnessing and giving from our work, especially those of us in business who earn well. Let's give really generously. That's what we're there for. But it's not the only thing we're there for. How do we do the stuff that we're doing in secular work, not 24/7, I hope, but 9 to 5, 9 to 8, whatever it is you do, and really build God's kingdom? So I want to switch tack a little bit here and introduce a guy called Bernie. Anyone recognize Bernie? He's quite well known. Bernie was born in Alberta, Canada in 1941. To a devout Christian family, and he actually spent a few years of his upbringing living in a New Mexico mission post, so like proper Mish kid, not just Christian, but like Mish kid, man. He was sporty, big basketballer. I think he's about 6'5" or something ridiculous, very bright. He got a scholarship to a top university in Mississippi in the US. After graduating and doing a bit of PE stuff, he started getting into startups, and he actually started a small chain of motels. And then he went on to start a telecoms business with a couple of mates, but he was very much the founder and CEO. In parallel with that, he and his family built a life in Mississippi. They were part of East Haven Baptist Church. They were very committed. So Bernie used to speak in church from time to time. He was a Sunday school teacher. And in his work life, he was also known as a devout Christian. So Bernie was actually quite well known for opening business meetings in prayer, which I think even in the south of the US isn't something that necessarily happens that much, right? Over 20 years in business, Bernie was very successful, employing tens of thousands of people, amassing billions of dollars of wealth. But Bernie was also a giver. He led a $100 million fundraiser for his alma mater college in Mississippi, and President George Bush appointed him as the chair of a special advisory committee. So Bernie really, for everyone that knew him, he was like a shining example of what it looks like to be a Christian leader working in the secular world. But like all of us, I'm afraid to say that Bernie also had a dark side. This is the dark side of Bernie. Just let you wonder what that is for a minute. I work in business, so I'm pretty good with PowerPoint, man. Check the skills. Yeah, Bernie. So, yeah, when the dot-com bubble burst, some of you guys remember that happening, and a lot of tech and telecoms type businesses had a tough time. He'd been implementing this super aggressive growth strategy to maximize the valuation of the business, and taken on a lot of debt. But that strategy started to fail when the bubble burst. And so Bernie decided to get creative in the accounting realm. Do we have any accountants here? Any creative accountants? I hope not. So Bernie got very creative, and he had this brilliant idea with his CFO and others to start reclassifying expenses as investments. And over about, I think, 5 or 6 years, $11 billion of expenses were reclassified as investments. So their company managed to look good, look strong. The company, by the way, is called WorldCom. Anyone heard of WorldCom? Yeah, you'll know where this is going. Eventually, as it always does, the truth came out. The auditors smelt, I think it took them too long. I think it was Arthur Anderson, by the way, but the auditors did eventually work out what was happening. And Bernie's immediate response was to start blaming everyone underneath him. He actually, at the time that he was being it was being investigated, he got up in front of his church and said, "I assure you, you don't go to church with a crook," right? So he was pretty forthright about it. But in the end, he was imprisoned. He was given a 25-year sentence for gross fraud. He was released, actually, after 13 years for bad health, and he died a month later, tragically. But Bernie has been rated the worst CEO in history, at least in U.S. history. And at the time, it was the biggest fraud in U.S. history. I think then Enron happened, and Enron was a little bit bigger, but still, it's pretty bad, right? But let's not just focus on Bernie and the numbers. Like, actually, that destroyed many livelihoods. 30,000 people lost their jobs because of Bernie. And he wiped off $175 billion of value from the stock market. WorldCom was worth nothing after this, right? Now, you might be thinking, oh, that's like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, people like that, they took a little hit. No, it's thousands of pensioners, people who've been saving for years and years for their pension. One guy, he'd saved like $1 million nest egg for his pension. After this, it was worth nothing. He had to keep working till he died. That's the impact of what Bernie did. So I don't want to get too into that story, but he really tarnished not just the reputation of Christians in leadership in the working world, but he also hurt thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. So I want to ask you this morning, what was the problem? Was Bernie the problem? Was big business the problem? Is business inherently greedy, selfish, something that we should keep out of, basically? Well, to answer that, I want us to focus on someone else, the Great Gatsby. Sorry, not another rich American guy with dodgy ethics, but the real Gatsby. Sorry, just... So, to be honest, I've never eaten one. Have you guys, has many of you had it? I mean, it's very much a Cape Town thing, right? I'm quite up for it, but yeah, so this is a Gatsby. Now, I wanted to know what was in a Gatsby, so I called a good friend of mine, who I won't name, and he told me, look, listen, man, a Gatsby's only a Gatsby if it's got these 4 things in it. First, you need a foot long, not just a roll, man, a foot long, right? You might have to get up and preach this, Ryan, but I'll try. Foot long, you need not just chips, we need slap chips, right? Nice and greasy. You need some meat. I think this is technically fried polony, but I mean, it could be roadkill, it could be anything. And you need some sauce. Sorry, bro, sorry. So what I want to do this morning, I know this is probably heretical to some of you, but I'm going to reinvent the Gatsby as an illustration, a systematic theology, as it were, of business or secular work. So with that, I'm going to borrow from a guy called Wayne Grudem, who wrote a brilliant long book called Systematic Theology, but a really good short book, which I read, called Business for the Glory of God, which is a bit of a spoiler for what I'm going to say. So let's go. Thank you. So I'm going to explore the 5 fundamental components of business and secular work and what the Bible says about them. And I could probably give you 10 verses on each of these, but just a quick, lightweight, I'm a business guy, so let's get going. Ownership. Right, the first thing, no organization can happen without investment. It starts, the genesis of any organization is someone putting in some resources of their own. Maybe it's money, maybe it's other things. And the Bible really respects this idea of personal ownership, of having stuff that's yours, right? Exodus, right from the beginning in the law, you shall not steal. And the reason, I think, is because God wants us to imitate the way that he has sovereignty over the whole universe and ownership of the whole universe in the way that we exercise sovereignty over our tiny, tiny little portion of it, right? So when we exercise ownership, when we use our personal assets with wisdom, with creativity, with generosity, with fairness, that delights God, that worships God. The next piece of the Gatsby, the slap chips, making stuff, or in business speak, products and services, right? So in Genesis, the command God gave Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And, Greek scholar, kind of vague, but subdue, I'm told, in the Greek, it's like, the Hebrew, I guess. Sorry, Ryan was giving me like a concern look. But it means to make these resources useful. God made us to design, to invent, to craft, to manufacture things. And whether we do that in producing food or housing or transport or other things that are useful or just things that are beautiful, art, music, for its own sake, in all these ways we can imitate God's creativity. The next layer, the meat, employment. So Jesus said, Luke 10:7, the laborer deserves his wages. There are many parables, actually, where Jesus talked about people employing each other. And in all cases, Jesus referred to that part of the parable in a positive light. Most of the work that we do, whether it's plumbing or teaching or coding, would be impossible without employment. And it's actually a uniquely human trait. I don't know about you, but I don't know of any animals that have contracts and pay each other money to do stuff. And there are opportunities on both sides of the equation, whether the employer or the employee. There are opportunities to glorify God in employment by imitating his fairness, his honesty, his skill, and his hard work. If we work or employ in that way, we're imitating God, and that glorifies and delights him. And the last layer of the Gatsby here, the source, buying and selling, trade. Says here in Leviticus, if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. I.e., in a trade, I buy, you sell, or whatever, both sides can do right. It's necessary, obviously, for us to do anything beyond subsistence living to actually buy and trade goods. It's like the foundation of all economic growth. And actually, more importantly, it's how we glorify God by sharing the earth's resources and the things that we've made. I also want to say my own career, and I'll say a bit more later, but has been very much focused on building products and services for people at the bottom of the economic pyramid in Africa. And my own conviction is that in some cases handouts are important and the only way to help people. But if you can produce something, a product or a service that people without much money really, really need and really value and can afford, that dignifies them. You can give anyone a handout, but people are only going to buy stuff from you if they really want it and they value it and they believe it's going to make a difference in their life. So I see great dignity in fair trade, and I think it glorifies God as well. And that brings us to the best part of all, eating. Some of you are feeling hungry, some of you maybe not so when you see this picture. I know Cricky, my wife, is vegetarian. She's like, oh, please move on. Sorry. But Jesus, in the parable of the miners and the parable of the talents and elsewhere, talked about these illustrations of making profit. He talked about what laborers, being given money and then the master coming back, and the ones who had traded profitably were even more rewarded. So he endorsed the idea of fair profit. And for any organization, any business, profit is the lifeblood. So just like I'm going to be dead if my heart stops and my blood stops going around, any business is going to be dead if there's not profit, at least in the long term, right? So profit's the lifeblood of businesses, and it's endorsed in the Bible. Profit happens when we make something and we can sell it for more than it cost us. And that is a sign that we have added value, that we've created something that's useful, that's worth something to someone, or it should be. Profit should be a fair reward for our work, for our investment, for the risks we've taken in producing those goods. And it's an indicator that we're serving a real need. And also profit's an indicator that the business or the organization we've created is actually stable and can employ people in the longer term. So this is what I want to get to. Profit, I don't believe, is the purpose of business. Just like, is my purpose just to circulate blood around my body? No, man, that's like boring. My purpose is to live, it's to serve. Same as business. The purpose of business is to serve and employ, and profit is an indicator that it's going to be able to do that. So that's I guess, a quick biblical framework for business and why I believe business is a calling. Business, and not just business, any kind of secular work is something we can be called to do that's dignified, every element in the Bible. But what about the reality? Well, I think we've heard about Bernie already. Just like we can have good or bad Gatsbys, we can have good or bad ways of working and good or bad organizations. So at this point, I think I'm going to introduce another slightly less ridiculous framework. And this is from an organization called Praxis. This is a US-based kind of think tank and incubator that basically wants to help people working in secular work, particularly leaders in secular work, to really work out what it means to glorify God there, what it means to build God's kingdom through secular work. And they have this framework, which I'm going to just talk through now quickly. 3 ways of working, 3 types of leader, 3 types of organization. Exploitative, ethical, and redemptive. And I think these ways of working, these types of organization, this can apply at any level. It can be from your household, how you treat your domestic worker, all the way up to you're the CEO of a big JSE-listed business and how you run the business. The principles, all the same, apply in my view. So let's explore them. Firstly, exploitative. It's not a very nice word, is it? Since the fall, all of us have been tarnished by selfishness, right? Our sin has made us greedy. It's made us focused on selfish gain, things that don't actually satisfy but look shiny. And that's brought drudgery into work. It's brought the curse into work. Exploitative organizations and exploitative ways of working are I win, you lose. Exploitative organizations cultivate in their strategy to degrade culture, to exploit things like idolatry and insecurity. Come buy this shiny new thing. It's going to make you a real man. It's going to make you cool. It's going to make you look better than everyone else. Or they trap you. They sell you something. Maybe it's something a bit addictive, like gambling, or maybe it's something that you just think you need and you don't, and you keep wanting to buy, but it drains you. In their operations, exploitative organizations use people. My first job, you won't feel very sorry for me, but I was a management consultant. And I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. I worked for this organization. I mean, it was a nice brand, and it was a bit, we had a flashy office, but it was a sweatshop, man. I mean, I was in there, I regularly slept under my desk. On Sunday nights, I would always get super anxious because I didn't know this week, am I coming home in the evenings, or am I just working? The weekends I'd work. I'd sometimes do 80, 90-hour weeks, sometimes do 50, but I felt used. I didn't feel like a valued individual employee in the company. I felt like an asset that was being exploited, right? And I'm sure, Bernie's just one like big kind of bang example I'd have used earlier, but all of us have probably experienced the pain of being part of or coming into contact with exploitative organizations, exploitative ways of working. It's everywhere. If we pick up a newspaper, we'll find like 10 examples of exploitative ways of working, I'm sure. And when Jesus went into the temple courts, you remember in Matthew 21, where Jesus went into the temple courts and saw what the traders there were doing, dodgy, exploitative ways of business, really, that kind of degrading the culture of how the temple should have been. He made his intentions clear. He went in with a whip and chased them out. So let's be clear, Jesus has no time for Christians working in this way. None of us should be part of exploitative practices. Some of us may be part of organizations where exploitative practices are happening. I think it's probably all of us are if we're in big organizations because they're big and complex. But in our sphere, we can't be exploiting. So that brings us to the second way of working. Give me a moment. Ethical. So ethical ways of working are win-win, right? It's like we want to advance culture, build things, make stuff that people really want and really need, that's good for them, and respect the people that work in our organization. So I think this is, when we think of in bigger corporates like governance and compliance or terms like CSR and ESG, all of these things, I think, for me, revolve around what this idea of this question of what it looks like to be an ethical business or an ethical organization. And I'd say this is what the world expects of us as Christians, right? It's also what the world expects of big companies that are listed nowadays. The reality is we often fall short. I've fallen short of this in my own life, probably many times. So working ethically is good, and I think this is really a good way to look at things. Is this enough? Is this Jesus' calling for us to work ethically in the world? Well, I'd ask you, was Jesus ethical? Yeah, I think he was always ethical. But he wasn't just a good ethical teacher. He didn't just treat people fairly. He was redemptive. He gave of himself. He gave up his own life for us and for everyone he came in contact with. So that brings us to the third way, the redemptive way. And I think this is really speaking to the calling that Jesus has given us to take up our cross and follow him. So this goes beyond living ethically to actually restoring the world through self-sacrifice and to lovingly provide the people we serve with tools and pathways for transformation. It's going beyond just being a fair employer, paying a good market rate, but actually really loving the people who work with us, looking out for their long-term needs, helping them to progress. Dare I say, giving them grace more than they deserve. Some of you are thinking, like, really? I mean, I look at this and I think, wow, how am I going to live like this in Vodacom, right? Or in any big corporate? It's not easy. And we have to think about the sphere of influence that we do have, not the whole organization, because we can't control everything. But, when you look at how Jesus lived, what he called us to, it's clear that this is what he's calling us to. But also, let's just quickly think about biblical history. So, when the law was given in Leviticus, a couple of principles I want to just click on. We don't talk about them often in church, but gleaning. Does anyone remember what gleaning is? Leviticus 19, right? So when you're harvesting a crop, you don't profit maximize. You leave a corner And that's for people who don't have food. And you don't give it to them. It's not a handout. They have to come and pick it and get it. But you're creating a pathway for redemption by doing that, by leaving some profit on the table. Or what about the Law of Jubilee, which had a couple of components, but in Leviticus 25, the whole Israelite nation was commanded every 50 years to have a year of Jubilee, and basically I think it was like a big party, where they came together and said, all debts cancelled, everyone who's got themselves into bonded labor, you're free, and if your land that your family owned was sold or lent to someone else, mortgaged out, it goes back to you. Everything resets. So it's like an incredible social safety net to make sure that even people who'd maybe lived foolishly and got themselves into a bad financial situation, but they were trapped there, could find a way out. So that redemptive purpose, those redemptive ways of working, are in the Bible all the way through. This isn't something new that came with Jesus and his sacrifice. This is something his people have always been called to. Not just short-term profit. So I think now, just to help us see what this means in practice, I want to just pick on a couple of real-world examples here in South Africa. So firstly, I want to introduce you to Sia. This is Sia Kluser. He's quite a young guy. So Sia grew up in a township, I think in the Eastern Cape, and he was captivated one morning in '94 when he saw aeroplanes flying over the township low. They were actually dropping off election leaflets. But Sia was much more excited about the science behind these aeroplanes than the politics of the election. And that gave him that was the beginning of a lifelong passion for science and innovation in Sia. So Sia actually ended up getting a scholarship, an engineering scholarship to Harvard University, where he studied, but he worked on microfuel cells. He wanted to create a way for people living in townships or places that were off-grid to be able to power things like their cell phone battery or things in their home. Sia worked incredibly hard. He did hundreds of experiments, failure, all through his studies and afterwards. And then eventually, he managed to get some patents on a microfuel cell technology which worked. And Sia could have found big applications for it in the US market, but Sia straight away came back to SA. And as soon as he got back, he started getting approached. He'd built up a bit of a name for himself already. He was a bit of a rising star. He started getting approached by big energy companies, come and help us work on our coal energy processes. I'm not trying to slate that industry, but Sia knew that wasn't for him, that wasn't God's calling. So he turned down big salary, really exciting jobs, great career progression. No, I want to work on clean energy. I want to work on these microfuel cells. And I want to work through local governments. So he started going to local governments, but as some of you have probably experienced, he faced some barriers, and he was told, you're going to need to pay us a commission if you want to work in this area. Sia tried and failed. But he stuck to his redemptive purpose that he knew God had called him to. Now, Sia just last year started a business called Galactic Energy Ventures, which is a transcontinental energy marketplace for clean energy. So Sia's managed, I think God has given him favor, but he didn't take the easy road, right? And I think redemptive ways of working are never the shortcut. It's never the quick route to success. Now I want to introduce you to Philippa. Philippa, I don't know how you say it. Is it Geert or is it Geert? I don't know. Anyway, Philippa, Philippa's a mother, and she grew up quite privileged, but she was struck by the economic pressure that mothers particularly are in this country. So a couple of statistics. Did you know that 40% of women in South Africa are single mothers? And 60% of children are being raised without a father. So you put two and two together, huge pressure on mothers to both raise children and provide for them economically. And I know many of us in the room have felt or supported people under that pressure. So Philippa was taking a career gap, I think because she was mothering full-time, and she was standing in the car park outside the school one day and got chatting to a lady, also a mother, who wanted to get back into work. and she was telling Philippa, I've reached out to like 10 recruitment agencies. None of them is interested because they don't want someone working part-time. They're not interested in flexible work. They don't really think I've been doing anything the last few years, even though I've been like raising a family, which is probably the hardest thing you can ever do. So that was the genesis of an idea. And Philippa actually started Recruit My Mum. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Recruit My Mum, which is a recruitment agency for mothers that offers mothers the benefits of flexible working and employers the access basically to the best people in the country, right? Mothers, honestly, I mean, I'm married to a mother of 4. You don't get better workers than a mother. And she's affected countless thousands of lives of women, and I think shown employers the true value of women and mothers in work. So just coming, as we draw towards the close, just to my own experiences, and I don't want to give you any big detail, but in my 20 years of my career, about half of them have been based in South Africa. We've been here for nearly 5 years, and we were in Cape Town for about 4 years. And I've been involved in, I guess, 4 different business ventures which have had, I've been there because of like this sense of like wanting to do something redemptive through business. Just to talk quickly about them. Top left, this is Mama Rosi in Philippi in Cape Town with a food tent. So this was actually a social venture that I was leading for about a year. Someone else founded and left. And we were trying to empower entrepreneurs like Mama Rosi to grow their own food and sell it into their community. Failed. The economics didn't work. People couldn't pay enough for the kale to make it worthwhile for the entrepreneur. The bottom left, this is Streetwise. This is a really radical product that we invented, a company called SciTech, also in Cape Town that I worked for, and I was responsible for this product. And it was designed to bring the power of internet access, so email, free educational content, news, things like that, into deep rural areas where there was no power necessarily and very poor connectivity. So we invented this like text-based, low-cost terminal. I should have bought one, actually. I have a few in my study still. Failed. We invested millions of rands, failed. We didn't get enough sales to kind of complete the product development. It's just difficult. Top right, this is Luwot. So you can see there the toilet there Ryan mentioned before. It's a waterless toilet. We've deployed a few thousand now in places like Manila in the Philippines, in Madagascar, and we're about to deploy about 500 into etiquette in Durban. And this is a toilet that we hope will bring people dignity, improved hygiene and health, and improved safety. Because the reality is most people in South Africa today are using shared pit latrines or chemical toilets. So this is a way that someone without any drainage to their home can get a proper toilet because it's waterless. It's on the brink. This business, we're constantly having to go and beg for more money because this is not a cheap thing to build. So I'm optimistic, but you know, we're constantly on the brink of failure, to be quite honest. I'm chairman of the business, so I feel the pressure of this one. And then bottom right, this is M-Pesa. M-Pesa has offered, over the last 15 years, mobile banking, basically, to people who banks would never reach in 6 African countries. Currently, I'm responsible for 5 of them, the 5 ones. Kenya's like the famous one. I'm responsible for the other 5, Tanzania, Mozambique, DRC, Lesotho, Ghana, that no one talks about. But you know what? This is a 5 billion rand business now, and we have 18 million customers in those 5 markets. And it was difficult at first. We weren't profitable for the first 3 or 4 years in each of these countries. It took a lot of persuasion, keep investing. But now it's actually the biggest growth engine for Vodacom outside South Africa, and it's a reasonably profitable business. So that's just some of my own experiences. So failure, I mean, if I'd stopped after here or here, you know, you never get to the good stuff unless you pass through some failure, I believe. Also, the sphere of influence. I haven't talked about the stuff I did for like 8 years before any of this, which just often felt like I can't influence much. You know, I'm just like a 20-something working in this massive business world. But I believe each of us has a sphere of influence, and God's calling us to use it. To be honest, my challenge now is what I do might look good and shiny on the outside, it might look redemptive in purpose, but it's the day-to-day. And this is where I think the rubber really hits the road. Integrity in the small stuff. Standing up for truth, standing up for the customer, standing up for employees in your workforce, speaking truth to power, to people with strong opinions, compromising your own career progression because you're willing to make a stand, or saying, no, I don't want that opportunity because I believe my purpose lies elsewhere. For me, that's the daily challenge. I mess up all the time. But I think that's a challenge we can share. So I'm not trying to say you should all do the kind of grassrootsy stuff that I've done. You know, you might be in mining or manufacturing. You might be a plumber or a politician. You might be in a creative agency, or you might be an accountant. It doesn't matter. Wherever you are, God wants to use you redemptively. Not just ethically, but redemptively. So I think that brings us towards a close. I've always wanted to say this. As the band comes up... So, thanks, guys. Tinkle away. As the band comes up, feels good. I just want to come back to Romans and this passage, and also back to our vision of renewal and of city renewal. How are we going to renew the city if we can't renew our own workplaces, right? This is our mission as a church we're talking about. I believe all of us in secular work are called to mission in the day-to-day of what we do, as well as sharing the gospel and giving generously with the resources that we're earning. And now, this morning, I just feel some of us have felt compromised, maybe a little bit like Bernie, like we've been living a double life. And I believe God wants to give us grace this morning. He wants us to repent so that he can renew our minds and help us see how we can worship him day to day, in the nitty-gritty detail, in the imperfection, in the real world that we live in. I believe others of us, God is calling to step into a greater sphere of influence, to be brave, to stand up, to lean in. Maybe for some of us it's actually a career change. Maybe God wants to put us somewhere new so we can do something more redemptive. So we're going to have an opportunity to pray. Please come forward. I'll be here with Ryan and the other elders. We'd love to pray for you. I'd also really encourage you, maybe even more than that, let this be something that we talk about in our small groups this week, with your mates in church. Please start talking about the day-to-day challenges you face in the workplace of how to live authentically. You know, we talk plenty about our career development, what job I'm going to do next, how I'm going to get a bigger salary, you know, the shiny stuff, the selfish stuff. But let's start talking about what we're actually doing and being honest about our challenges and our failures to live redemptively in the workplace. That's my encouragement to you all. So we're going to worship together. We're going to sing this song. And then please come forward if you'd like some prayer. Thanks.